When you have applications that you want to make available to users on different networks, you need to publish them. Now these will typically be things like your web server, your Outlook web access, your mail server, FTP servers, and pretty much any other services that you want people to have access to. Now, of course, we still require these services to remain as secure as possible though, but we need to have external access. Now before we get started here and we begin looking at how we can publish things, you first need to have some basic housekeeping in order, as the very first thing you want to give consideration to is your DNS. So if we take a bird's eye look at a typical network, we most likely are going to have a scenario that looks like the image you see here. We've got our internal network here. This will be using private IP addresses. Things like your 192.168 range or your 10.0 range. We're most likely going to have a DMZ where our published servers are going to live to protect our internal network. And of course, these servers are also going to be configured with private IP addresses. And our ISA server itself, this one is going to have a public routable address that allows it to connect to the internet. And on the inside of our network, we're most likely going to have an internal DNS server, which also has a private IP address. And when any of our internal users wants to access our web server, which of course lives over here in our DMZ, our DNS server is going to happily hand out the IP address to that user. And since our ISA server here is directly connected to our local LAN, our user is going to be able to access our web server just fine. However, when a user out here on the internet, when they attempt to access our internal web server, their computer's request is going to hit our ISA server here, and it's going to forward on that request to our DNS server, which of course is our internal DNS server, and it's going to look up the IP address for our web server, which is going to be something like 10.64.0.10, and it's going to send that back. Now, since the IP address of our web server is a private IP address, this user here out on the internet is not going to be able to get there because obviously it can't route to a private address. So the result is that the user who's coming to visit our site is never going to get there. So what needs to happen is that our DNS server over here needs to return the external or the public IP address for our internet user to be able to access our web server. So the solution to this problem is to use split DNS. And this means we can leave our internal DNS server here to handle all of our internal DNS requirements. So it's still going to hand out this private IP address here, and that'll be true for all of our hosts, including all of them in our DMZ. And we're going to have a second DNS server that only has the IP addresses for the servers that we're publishing. And this DNS server will hand out the external ISA server's IP address to the internet users. Now, whilst the topic of this video is about publishing servers, it's not intended to be a tutorial on DNS. I really wanted to start with this DNS discussion though, because hopefully by now you'd realise that if DNS isn't working properly, inside your network you mightn't see any problems, but outside the world is falling to bits. So although a lot of you will already have solutions in place for this, as you're most likely running established networks and you have your web servers and so forth, but this is something that's worth knowing regardless. Alright, well let's move on and let's go and find something we can publish. Now the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to set up our DMZ. Now you might recall back in our first couple of videos when we installed ISA server, we added in a third network interface and we called it DMZ, so it was easy to identify what we were using it for. However, up until now, we haven't configured ISA server to use it, so we'll go and set it up so that ISA server recognizes it as a valid network. So in our ISA server management console under the well, we'll expand our server first, we'll expand configuration, we'll select networks, and over here in the right in our tasks pane, we're going to choose to create a new network rule. As you'd expect, this starts up a new wizard, so we'll call this DMZ and we'll click Next. Now we'll need to define where the traffic is coming from, which of course is going to be our DMZ, so we'll click Add. And normally, you'd probably be expecting me to expand networks and select our DMZ. But as you can see, there is no DMZ yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the new menu and we'll select Network, and this is going to start up another wizard. So we'll need to give this a name again, so we'll give it a name of DMZ. We'll click Next. This network is going to be a perimeter network, and if you read the text here, it'll tell you that this is the type of network you want if you're publishing servers to the internet. So we'll select perimeter network, we'll click Next. Alright, now here we're going to have to specify the IP addresses that this new DMZ network will have. But since we've done it the smart way, we actually don't need to enter in any addresses here. We'll simply click the Add Adapter button. We'll choose our DMZ network interface and we'll click OK. Then we'll click Next and then we'll click Finish. Okay, now we can expand networks and choose our DMZ. We'll click Add, Close, and then Next. Alright, now where's the traffic going to? Well, it's going to the internet, so we'll click Add, we'll expand networks, we'll choose External, and we'll click Add, Close, and Next again. Alright, well, now we'll need to configure how the traffic is going to be sent between our DMZ and the internet. Now, since our DMZ is using private IP addresses, and we know that users on the internet can't talk to our private IP address, we'll need to NAT this traffic. So what will happen is the ISA server will simply take the private IP address of the DMZ server and replace it with its own external IP address whenever a user from the internet wants to talk to it. That way, the internet users will be able to reach our network. So we're going to choose the default, which is to NAT this traffic, and we'll click Next and then Finish. And as you'd expect, we'll now need to apply this change to our server. So now that our ISA server knows how to handle requests for services that are on our DMZ, it's time to publish something. So over on the left, if we select the firewall policy, over on the right, we'll select our tasks pane, and here you can see we've got 5 different publishing options. We can publish Exchange web client access, we can publish a mail server, SharePoint sites, websites, or other non-web server protocols. So let's first take a look at how to publish a web server, because that's certainly going to be one of the most popular types of servers that you'll want to publish. So we'll click on this link here to publish our websites, and in a totally unexpected move, it starts up a new wizard. Okay, well, you probably guessed that it would, so let's just begin. We'll give this a name. I'm going to call it www.jawkus.com. We'll click Next. Now we're going to want to allow people to connect to our web server, so we'll choose Allow. We'll click Next. We'll choose what publishing type we're interested in. Do we want to publish a single website or load balancer, a farm, or multiple farms? Well, we only need to publish a single site, so we'll leave the default at the top option and we'll click Next. Now, will we be using SSL or not to connect to our web server? Well, since SSL does require me to have a server certificate on our web server, we're going to go with the second option here and not use SSL. But in a production environment, you'd obviously use SSL if you can. So we'll choose the bottom option, we'll click Next. All right, now what is the internal site name? Now, as it says here, the internal site name is the name of the site as it appears internally. So that's going to be www.jawkus.com. But remember, you will need to have this name in DNS or your internal users won't be able to resolve the name. Now, if you can't resolve the name of the site, you could check this box down the bottom here and just enter in the computer name or an IP address for your published server. So for our web server, we could enter in the IP address as 10.64.0.10, and our ISA server would then be able to access the server that way if DNS isn't configured. Now, this field here also does have importance on the next page, so we'll click Next. Now, if you want to publish the entire website, then you won't need to enter anything in this optional path field. You'll only use this field if you want to publish a specific folder. So if we were to enter in something like sales here, then down the bottom here, you'll see that the published site would now be jawkers.com/sales. So if we remove the sales, you'll see this just defaults to the entire site. Now here, by the way, is where that previous page settings are going to impact this page. Now at the bottom here, we've got this checkbox where we can also choose to forward the original host header instead of the actual one, which of course is going to be our server name of our web server, which has the name of la-web.jawkers.com. You see, by default, the ISA server will take the original host header, which in our case will be a request for the homepage at www.jawkers.com, and it's going to replace this line, this www.jawkers.com, it's going to replace it with the computer name or the IP address that we would have specified on the previous page here. And that's fine if you only have a single website on that server. But if I happen to be running another website, let's say I'm running jawkers.net, then that request would be routed to the default website, which might be the wrong one. So by checking this box here, then the original host header will stay with the request and we'll be able to send it to the correct website on our server. So for my requirements here, it really doesn't matter whether I check this box or not, but if you're running more than one website on this server, then you definitely will want to check that box there. Alright, well let's click Next, and for the public details for our site, the default is to accept requests for this domain name only, which we'll need to type here below, or we could choose to accept requests for any domain name, which simply means that anyone who types in a URL or IP address into their browser that resolves to our ISA server's external interface will end up at our jawkers.com website. So we'll leave it at the default, it really doesn't matter, this domain name, and we'll enter in the domain, which is of course jawkers.com. And we can enter in a path here as well if we like, just like in our previous screen. So if we use the same example we did before and we entered in sales here, you'll see that the actual folder we'll be publishing will be jawkers.com/sales. So we'll leave this blank here and we'll click Next. Alright, now here we'll need to specify a web listener, and a web listener simply tells the ISA server which port and IP address to listen for our web requests. Now, we don't actually have any defined yet, so we're going to click on the New button here, and this will open up a new wizard. So I'll give this rule a name of www.jawkers.com. We'll click Next. Firstly, we'll need to choose whether or not we'll require SSL connections. We'll say Not, and we'll click Next. Now, where are the requests going to be coming from? Well, since this is a web server, requests for our website should definitely be coming in from the internet. So we'll select the external interface here for our web listener. But if you also want your internal users to be able to access this web server as well, and you probably will, then we'll need to select the internal network as well. Now also note that by default, the ISA server will compress content that it sends to clients, as long as those clients requesting it supports compression. So there's nothing really that we need to change there. We'll just click Next. Now here we can choose if we want clients to have to authenticate with our ISA server, and there's plenty of authentication methods available. We've got Basic, Digest, and of course Integrated. And down the bottom here, depending on what we have selected above, we can choose from Active Directory, LDAP Radius, and so forth. And from our drop-down box here, we can choose from HTTP authentication or HTML form authentication. And of course, at the bottom, we can choose no authentication. Now this is going to be, of course, a public web server, so we're going to choose none here. We really don't need any authentication. We're just going to click Next. Now single sign-on is the next screen, but it is greyed out since we didn't choose HTML form authentication on the previous screen, so there's really nothing we need to do here except for clicking Next and then Finish. Alright, well there's our web listener. It's already populated for us now, and if you want to make any changes to this, you can click the Edit button, and you'll note that if we do click that, we're then able to add in a description if we like. On the Networks tab, we can change any of the networks we've just configured. The Connections tab allows us to enable or disable HTTP or SSL. And if we click the Advanced button, we can also set the number of connections to this web server as well if we like. Now you can see that it is currently set to unlimited, and that's probably fine for most people. And you can, by the way, also configure this restriction in IIS itself. But doing it here allows us to drop connections at the ISIS server if you do decide to set a maximum here. And that'll prevent your IIS server from having to do the work itself. And of course, that's a nice touch. All right, well, we're going to leave our listener as it is. We'll click Next. And now, after ISIS server has validated the credentials, it's going to use one of these two methods here to authenticate with the published server. So either we're going to use no delegation and it won't allow the client to authenticate directly, or no delegation, but it will allow the client to authenticate directly. And the difference between the two is, well, with the second one, this allows the ISIS server to pass on the user's credentials to our published server without ever getting involved. It just hands them over. Now in the other case here, the top one, the ISIS server wouldn't allow that to happen. Now we're not going to need this anyway, so we're just going to leave the default. We'll click Next. We'll apply this to all users. We'll click Next and then Finish. And as usual, we will need to apply that change to take effect. Okay, well, we've now created the listener, but we're also going to need to create an access rule to allow access to our website. So we're going to click on Create Access Rule, and of course that'll start up the wizard. So we'll call this rule Access to Jawkis.com, and we'll click Next. We of course are going to allow this access. We'll click Next. We'll leave it at selected protocols, and from the list here we're going to click Add, and we're going to expand web and choose HTTP. Now maybe we'll also support HTTPS, so that's an option. We'll add that in anyway. We'll click Add, and then we'll click Close, and then we'll click Next. All right, now the traffic is going to come from both our internal and external networks, so we'll click Add. We'll expand networks. We'll choose External and click Add, and then Internal and click Add. Now we can click Close. Now for the destination. Well, the traffic is going to our DMZ, so we'll click Add and we'll expand networks. Now we could simply just add in DMZ and that would work fine. But personally, while I'm dealing with a device like a firewall, I like to be very specific. So instead of adding access to the DMZ as a whole, I'm going to click the New button, and what we'll do is we'll create a new computer. So the name of our web server is la-web.jawkis.com, and the IP address is 10.64.0.10. I'm not going to bother about filling in a description here. We'll click OK. Now we'll expand computers and we'll choose our web server there. We'll click Add and then Close, and then Next. This will apply to all users. We'll click Next and then Finish, and then we'll apply that change. And now we're done. All right, now I've just switched over to our Windows Vista machine here on our internal network. So we're going to open up Internet Explorer, and we are going to navigate to www.jawkis.com, and we'll hit Enter. And there we can see the default under construction page from our IIS web server that lives inside our DMZ. But in order to have this name resolution work, you will need to make sure that both your internal DNS and any external DNS servers can reach or know about this server. Okay, so in this video, we've seen how to publish applications through our ISIS server and make them available to people from different networks, including the internet. Now, publishing servers isn't a difficult thing to do, but in order for this to work for your internet users, remember, you will need to have an external DNS server pointing to your external ISIS server interface, or you'll find those external users not being able to connect. And that really defeats the whole purpose of publishing the application in the first place. So we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.